Two amazing talks. So I've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to go really quick, so my apologies for being too fast. If you don't speak English, this is going to be worthless to you, okay? So I'm going to be talking about how we herd cats for fun and profit. A little bit of my background. So I'm a consultant. I work with companies to help them build communities, either inside companies or externally. I led community at Canonical, at XPRIZE, and at GitHub, and wrote a few books and some of the bits and pieces here and there. So I want to start talking about this guy called Frank, who I met a few years ago, joined an open source project. He was a big fan of the project, wanted to create something, started, downloaded the code, worked on it, submitted a pull request, and it was an absolute disaster. And it was incredibly unrewarding for him. He was met with frustration and people pushing back against him because he tried to contribute something and didn't fit exactly within the parameters of what they wanted. We see this all the time with developer communities, and our job, I think, is to help that process be smooth and efficient. And that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about today. I actually think, bizarrely, we can take a lot of inspiration from these people. Who likes McDonald's here?
Hash browns.
You bunch of liars. Some of you like McDonald's here. Okay. One of the things that's interesting about McDonald's is they've taken complex processes and boiled them down into predictable steps. Like if you think about how you build fries, how you make fries, for example, there's a complex cooking process there, but they've taken it where you take this box, put it into this box, press this button, and you get a predictable result. And you can go into a McDonald's in China, in Japan, in France, wherever, and get pretty much the same result. And I think that's, in many ways, what we're trying to do here, is to boil humanity down into predictable steps that deliver predictable results. The key here, in my mind, is that we're intentional. A lot of communities that we've seen around the world are fundamentally accidental, and the challenge with that is that it doesn't scale very well. I'm going to switch my phone off because you're all tweeting and it keeps beeping at me. Keep tweeting, that's new phone. So Google Pixel, recommended. So anyway, I think the key thing is to be intentional because, we see communities, they form accidentally and they don't scale very well. So when you try to grow them up or engage with them in different ways, it causes difficulty and frustration. I think that what we need to do here is to basically build one of these, an exoskeleton, a metaphorical outfit that you wrap around your community members that helps them to be successful. And this involves understanding multiple different layers of human psychology and engagement and incentivization. And the challenge here is that every community is different. You can't take the principles from one developer community and just apply them to another. This is one of the things that my clients often ask is like, well, tell us the things that have worked elsewhere and we can just take those and put them here. It doesn't work that way. We have to adapt because every community is a fundamentally different group of people. But I do believe that there is a blueprint. There are some fundamentals in how we build effective communities, either for developers or otherwise, that we can kind of take and apply it in different ways. And that's going to be largely what I'm going to be talking about today. So some of you may be familiar with this. This is the technology adoption curve. This is how technology is usually adopted over time, right? On the left, you have people who are brand new, who love it, and they're eager about it, and they start using it immediately. You then get the early adopters. Those people read Gizmodo, Mashable, etc. And then you get into the early majority, and then you start seeing kind of like my family coming into the outer edge of this. What's interesting to me is that I think you can apply something very similar to community productivity, is when people join, they kind of ramp up, and then you get this kind of regularity of regular contributors. What's interesting to me is that with both of these curves, you've got this notion of the chasm. And this is a gap in the technology adoption curve. This is basically where startups fall into and are never seen again. And we see the same thing in communities. People get started, they get cracking, and then they get confused, and they never have significant and sustained contributions, which to me is the most important thing that we have, significant and sustained contributions. Not one or the other, but both. This is where the lion's share of the work is, in my mind. So the way I think of this is the first step is expectations. There's two types of communities in the world, according to my definition at least. Read communities are people who get together to consume something, Taylor Swift fans, Stranger Things fans, Game of Thrones fans. You basically get these people together and they can communicate and do stuff with each other. Those communities are relatively simple to set up in my mind. Right communities are a lot more complicated because these are communities who get together to build something. And open source is a good example of that. Developer communities in some forms are a good example of that. Although developers who download an SDK and work on that and use that to build something typically are actually a read community, and the expectations are much more easily defined. But I think the first step here is we figure out what kind of community we have. Is it read or write? Because that defines what we're going to do. And then we build personas. If we don't know our audience, we can't build something effectively for them. And this seems like such a theoretical kind of whiteboard game that no one ever looks at, like a lot of companies do with values. Let's make values and then never read them again. But I think this is really critically important, and this should be reviewed and assessed before you do anything in your community. And I think of these typical areas, like what are the capabilities of the people you're building for? So for example, if we're building a developer community of people who are consuming an SDK for building web apps, what do we expect their capabilities to be? What programming languages do they know? What frameworks do they know? How much experience do they have? Are they new? Are they experienced? Do they have a commercial background? What are the motivators? Well, for a lot of open source developers, for example, they want to grow their technical skills, they want to build a resume, they want to meet people and have fun. And fun is one of the most important elements there. What are people scared of? In open source projects, people are scared of looking stupid, even though there is no stupid question. Well, actually, that's a lie. There's a lot of stupid questions, but you get my point. And then we, of course, have rewards. Like, how do people feel rewarded? Some people feel rewarded with gifts, and many people feel rewarded with reputation and kudos and respect from their peers. And how do people consume? Do they read Hacker News, Slashdot, a multitude of different places? This gives us a sense for each of the different community roles that we have, whether it's developers, translators, documentation writers, etc., what these people look like, and then how do we engage with them? So imagine we take one of these roles, a typical developer. I think what we then do is we then break them into three broad groups. New people, regulars, and core people who join these projects and use these technologies. The way in which we engage with these three groups is radically different. People who are new have no context, they have no relationships, they're nervous. A lot of the fears are much more prevalent than people who are further up the chain. People who are core people, you treat with white gloves. These are the people you take care of in your community. These are the people who will inspire the others. And in my mind, each of the groups to the right should act as a mentor to the groups on the left. The core people help the regulars help the newbies. So the way this typically works from what I've seen is, like, every community is formed from people who get started by using a product or service, and then they want to join the community. So typically people start using it. That's really important in itself. You've got to make sure that the conversion from being a user to a contributor is clear. Then typically what they do is they start up with workflow. They actually try to build something with software, and then what they typically do is then start building relationships. It's like the inverse of the sales pipeline, where you engage someone and then you sell them a product. In this case, typically people build something and then they build the relationships. Then what happens is you build growth in they develop growth in the community, they start doing interesting things, and then they ultimately can become leaders. Each of these pieces is a critical part of the pipeline in my mind. So this is the way I tend to think of it. This is kind of a visualization that's taken me years to kind of wrap my head around in terms of designing. I've been trying to figure out a way of visualizing what's been in my head for a little while, and it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But essentially, someone on the left-hand side here is brand new. The first thing that they need to do is to make their first contribution. That involves an on-ramp, and I'm going to walk through that in a little bit. That so many projects, so many companies get wrong, you know? And this is not like an explicit set of things to do. It's a framework in which to look at the problem. Then what happens is they've made their first contribution, and the next step is for them to transition between those three groups that I talked about earlier on. Typically, for new people, these are three different types of engagement, how you engage new, regular, and core people. And the way in which we do that is through incentivization, opportunities, and engagement. And those incentives and rewards are typically like intrinsic rewards, which are feeling good and respect, all that kind of good stuff, and extrinsic rewards, which are T-shirts and swag and Teslas and things like that. So wouldn't that be cool? So let's look at the first one. This is the on-ramp, okay? And again, this is not like a directive, like this is exactly what you have to do, and this varies depending on different types of people, but this is kind of a framework in which to think of this. Typically, when people are going to get started in a new community, they've got all this crap to think about. It's bug management and code hosting and communication and governance, translations, all these complicated things that we have to think about. And what leads on from all these considerations is the infrastructure. And I tend to think of the infrastructure as like a pipeline. It's like a pipeline that you flow oil through. Is that fundamentally everything in a community starts out as an idea in someone's head, and then it ends up as something on a screen. And there's all of these things that typically that connect between those two different points. How people have ideas, how do we communicate effectively? I mean, we already talked about Slack, which is just a wonderful contribution to community. How do people plan effectively? How do people build software effectively? You know, what are the coding conventions? What are the quality requirements? How do people do quality? Unit testing, automated testing, continuous integration, deployment. How do people ship? How do you support those releases when they come out? And then participation and governance. This is often what most community managers tend to focus on, is participation. In my mind, it's such a narrow part of the problem that gets way too much focus and attention. Participation is critical, but if we don't have like the infrastructure in place, if we don't have the workflow in place, then people will get started and they'll get confused. So I think the first step here is to map out what that looks like for your community, and then to think about the pieces that you put in place, whether it's GitHub or ZenHub, GitLab, Travis for CI, WordPress for publishing, things like that. So once we have that in place, this is then what I think of as the on-ramp. For a typical developer joining an open source project, or somebody who wants to use a developer technology, there's typically 6 things that you need to do. The first thing is they need to discover that they can actually contribute in some way, they can actually build something. And that's having a great website, that's outreach, engagement, social media, all of those pieces. And again, we look at the profile to determine how we reach out to those people. The second thing is setting up the tool chain. It's amazing to me how many people get this wrong. Like if the first thing you have to do is spend an hour getting the tools set up, you know, pasting in command line like links on, you know, from a GitHub repo, you've already lost. Like, setting up your tool chain should be as simple as one click or pasting in one command, and they should be up and running. The next thing is, typically then at that point, they've got the tools all set up. Now we need to develop the skills. And that's not just the actual SDK that you're using, but that's typically things like the languages that you're using, and then conventions. Like, what are the coding conventions to use this? How do people get apps submitted and reviewed and things such as that? Then, at this point, they've got all the knowledge in their head. Then they need to find something to work on. And this is, again, a great opportunity, is that you know, typically when people start out with an SDK or with an open source project, a lot of people don't have a lot of creativity in their heads about what they can do with that. So sharing the potential with that is so important. This is something that Apple have done really well. When they started out with the iPhone, they made developers understand the potential of that. And that's part of the reason why the iPhone innovated so much. The next piece is getting help, and this is a hugely important piece, which is we're human, we get stuck, we need to figure out, we need to ask questions. Personally, I'm a big fan of things like forums or support desks for this kind of thing. Slack is really good, but the downside of Slack is that if you're in a time zone where people aren't online at the time, then you might not be able to get that kind of support. But I like the mixture of the two, because real time is a lot more satisfying than posting to a forum. And then finally, and this is really critically important, is once they've made their first contribution, they've been through all of this. This is like running the gauntlet. We need to make those people feel like they are rock stars. They did something really well. We respect them. It's a tremendous contribution, no matter how simple it might be. So again, think of these 6 areas as like a lens in which to look at the problem. And think of this is not just about community. It's about infrastructure. It's about processes. It's about marketing. It's about the whole thing. All right, so that's the first chunk. Now let's look at the second piece. And this is typically where we talk about incentives, rewards, and opportunities. So for regulars who are that middle quadrant, what's interesting about regulars is they no longer care about the on-ramp. The on-ramp is getting to your first thing. You've done your first thing. For regulars, this is about circular workflow. So with anything, when you're a regular anywhere, at your company, at home, or whatever, you tend to do the same thing over and over again. And when you do this, and one of these things becomes a bit annoying, it then becomes a lot annoying, then it becomes incredibly annoying, and then you shoot yourself in your head, okay? And that's typically how it tends to work. Now, in the developer workflow, it tends to be something like this. You know, first of all, you need to understand the context of where you are, understand the standards of the project or the technology that you're using, be able to discuss with people, then write code, submit pull requests, do CI, review code, and then feel rewarded. And this is the thing that tends to happen over and over again. What's critically important here in my mind is the only way to learn how to do this well is to talk to your developers. we're all community managers, so we're surrounded by amazing people, right? All of you are the best people in the world, right? Hands down. But most of us don't know what it's like to write code in the same way that a developer does. And you've got to learn from your audience as far as I'm concerned. So this is like surveys, engagement, and reaching out to people. It's so important to do this in my mind, to do it well. Now, for the leaders, what's interesting is they typically only care about like the core pieces of this, but leaders typically care about, how you write code, submit it, do pull requests, all that kind of stuff. And then they also do mentoring and other bits and pieces as well. So for leaders, you want to really help to focus on the most important things that are relevant to them. But of course, like I mentioned earlier on, the goal is to have people go up from new to regular and then up to leaders. So eventually, everybody touches each piece of this process. Now, what's interesting to me, what's fascinating to me is that when you look at this is basically, again, kind of a way of thinking about how we build developer communities, is that what sits underneath all of this is something called behavioral economics. Is anyone familiar with this? No? So behavioral economics is fascinating. It's essentially the psychology of how people think. And we can't build human systems unless we understand how the brain works and how people operate, in my mind. And this is a fascinating art and science. And the thing about behavioral economics is the basic principle is that we are fundamentally, as humans, irrational. We think that we're rational, but we're not. If we were rational, no one would get drunk at the weekends, no one would do drugs, everybody would be thin and healthy, everybody would be, people certainly wouldn't be voting for Donald Trump in a couple of weeks. No offense to Trump supporters, but frankly, I don't care about your opinion. But we're irrational in really predictable ways. The way we act in irrational ways is very consistent, okay? A couple of examples. Tax return. Researchers found that we tend to cheat a little bit. We don't cheat a lot when we have the opportunity. We have a good sense of self-image, and we just kind of bend the rules a little bit. If you fill in a tax return, people will fiddle their numbers a little bit, and then if you sign at the end, you'll see a lot of fiddling. If you ask people to sign at the beginning, so they identify with their self-persona, and then you ask them to fill the numbers in, consistently cheating goes down. Another example, these signs. We're all familiar with these signs. In Scotland, Scottish people use this as more of a competition than a deterrent. No impact on the death rate, the accident rate, things like that. So they actually changed this sign to an unhappy face. The death rate and the accident rate went significantly down, caused a feedback loop. Another example, again related to cheating, is there was a research study done by Dan Ariely that found that when people had the opportunity to cheat, they'd cheat a little bit in these tests. When he asked them to read the 10 Commandments first, cheating went down significantly. Again, it was a reinforcement of a moral code. Nothing really to do with the religion, just more of a definition of a moral code. The challenge with behavioral economics is the maths is really difficult, and it can be hard to apply this in a practical manner to your communities. I'm really excited about this. I'm a complete nerd on this because I think this is a scaffolding in which we can think and look at communities. This guy is called Dr. David Rock, who is half man, half tiger. And he came up with an interesting study called the SCARF model, okay? And I want to share this as something that I think everybody here can practically apply to your work today. The SCARF model is basically 5 things that he found, he's a neuroscientist through education, that he discovered that are consistent in what people need. The first thing is status. We all care about status, whether it's a committer to a repository or not a committer. It's important that we all care about status, and that we understand those status points, and the clarity in how we transition between them is clear in how people use our communities. The second thing is certainty, is that we don't like uncertainty. It causes stress, it causes anxiety. So we need to provide clarity. This can be really hard for companies who have communities, because as a company, fundamentally, we have more information than our community members will ever have. We have context that they will never have. So we have to work extra hard at that. The third one is autonomy, which is essentially choice. If we don't provide choice to our community members, they get frustrated. This is the reason why when you go and buy a car, they ask you a million different configuration options. The next one is relatedness, which is different groups and how they relate to each other, marketing teams, engineering teams. People identify themselves, they're tribal in their individual groups, but we have to clarify how we connect together in those groups. The final one is fairness, which is essentially we want to be treated fairly as humans, but also we don't like to see other people treated unfairly. And that's the reason why justice is so important in our communities as well. What's interesting is that a good method of building things, from my experience, is to try to build the shittiest thing you've ever seen. So, for example, if you're going to build a great cell phone, think about what the worst cell phone will be. The no screen, half the buttons are missing. For me, it would be I'd only get phone calls from my mother-in-law, like that kind of thing. And so when we understand the opposites, we can then avoid them. So the things on the left here, the things we optimize for, the things on the right here, clicks, stress, limits, chaos, and bias are the things that we try to act against. So, you know, I'm going to wrap up right now. In conclusion, people put quotes in the slides to look clever. I'm no different. But to me, like, we see more and more complicated communities in the world, and that's great because people are understanding the nuances of how we build communities. But to me, the true challenge here is how we build simplicity and predictability. And when we do that well, we can scale our communities out infinitely. Thank you, everyone.